Launch the live stream.
Good afternoon. I'm Chris Lineberger. I'm the chair of the Center for Real Estate and Urban Analysis here at the George Washington University School of Business. I'm delighted to have you here at this session in the George Talks Business series. Our goal is to bring together conversations with interesting guests on a weekly basis on a wide-ranging series of topics. Our guest today is Jennifer Vey. Jennifer is Senior Fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, a think tank here in Washington, and Director of the Ann T. and Robert M. Bass Center for Transformative Placemaking. I've worked with Jennifer for nearly 20 years on about 8 different research topics, and she's been my guide on those research topics, and she's always made my output far better than it would have been if I didn't have her as part of the process. I'd like to start, since there are students in the room here, many of them are looking for what are they going to do next, and the question is, how could they become Jennifer Vey?
Sure. Well, thank you, Chris. So, let's see. How did I become Jennifer Vey? Well, I went to Bucknell University where I majored in geography, which in some ways I came into basically accidentally because I kept continually being interested in the classes that focused on the interaction of people and the economy and their environment. After college, after a few years, I went back to school. I went to UVA for a master's degree in urban planning. And from there, I went to work at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, mostly focused during that time on one of the key economic development initiatives at the time, which was the Empowerment Zone and Enterprise Community Program. And from there, I went to the Brookings Metro program in 2001, and I have been there ever since.
So you've been focusing, of course, on metropolitan development trends. This is how we live, work, and play in our metropolitan regions throughout the country. Can you help us understand what these environments look like? What are the demographic factors that are making these places change so dramatically over the last generation?
Sure. Well, first, I think the big issue is that the relationship between place and the economy is constantly evolving, and I think that's something that we really need to understand. So if you look back, for example, to the 19th century, it's a time when America's cities were growing not just to be centers of commerce, but really powerhouses of invention and of industry. Within those cities, the differing needs of artisans and retailers and other businesses and workers and manufacturers led to the clustering of these groups in different areas of the city, leading to the downtowns that we see today and even industrial districts. But by the time we got to the 20th century, those patterns really started to change dramatically with the rise of the automobile, land use and infrastructure policies that supported suburbanization, and the flight of people and jobs out of our urban areas and into more sprawling suburban communities, leaving a lot of distress behind. And these patterns really gave us that the segregation and the concentration and the sprawl, that mix that really characterizes our landscape today. But none of these patterns are static. And I think if you look today, as with past innovations, today's digital revolution, has incredible power to improve our environment and our health and our well-being. But at the same time, it's really causing a lot of disruptions in our landscape. So for example, if you think about the desire for greater collaboration and the rise of the sharing economy, that's really leading to higher demands for levels of density and proximity that really facilitate idea exchange, as well as the physical exchange of goods that kind of proximity and density enables. At the same time, you can look at our retail economy, which is really being shaken by the rise of e-commerce and the closing of brick and mortar establishments in ways that we're just sort of beginning to see and understand, but will obviously have really profound impacts on how we shop, for example. And then finally, if you look at changes in our office environment and the growing demand of remote work, of flexible work, and how that's shifting. We don't quite know what those shifts are going to mean, but certainly it may not bode well for a lot of isolated office buildings, for example. And as all these untethered workers have choices and where they want to be, it's going to cause greater competition in terms of wanting, those places that can provide the kind of amenities and just walkability and other things that workers might want. So again, on one hand, you have all these market disruptions, but on the other, it's being coupled with demographic revolution as well. So changing household structures, people delaying marriage, our growing and diverse population that's leading to its own changes. So this market demands coupled with demographic factors are really changing the geography of our economy and our landscape.
So you mentioned innovation, and Brookings and your new center, the Bass Center, has been focusing over the last few years on innovation districts, this brand new way by which we take technology and take it to the marketplace. Can you define what that is? What is an innovation district?
Sure. Well, since the middle part of the last century, the landscape of innovation has really been dominated more by isolated corporate research campuses, right? And these research parks that I think a lot of us are familiar with. And that was in part driven just by the trends in suburbanization that I talked about a moment ago, and in part because of the innovation economy itself that tended in that kind of post-war era where firms and researchers kind of wanted to keep their secrets secret. Well, that's really changed. As I referenced before, as you see this rise in demand for more collaboration in the innovation economy, what we're now seeing over the last 10 to 15 years is this complementary pattern growing around what we and others have been calling innovation districts. So these are really areas, we define them as basically geographic areas where anchor institutions and companies and startups are mixing with business incubators and accelerators in close proximity to one another. And these places tend to be fairly transit rich and walkable and maybe have high amenities, offices, retail, all kind of clustered together in these places. And so we're seeing these patterns emerge, one, in this country. So you can go to places like University City, around Drexel and Penn, in Philadelphia, or look at Kendall Square outside of, at the doorstep of MIT, and including MIT up in Cambridge, or the Cortex Innovation District area that's growing up in St. Louis, for example. And so a lot of these patterns they're all, on one hand, a result of market forces, some of the market forces that I talked about a moment ago, but they're also really driven by intentionality as well. I mean, I think the most successful places won't just be, a result of what's happening in the market, but by that kind of intentional vision that's being sent. Cortex being a great example. It was launched in 2002 with a range of institutions in that area, and they established a master plan, and they've been working to implement that plan over time and have created an awful lot of new firms and jobs in the process.
So as you know, my class here at the business school and the Golden Triangle Business Improvement District, which is just north of the GW campus, that we have a study going on about a potential innovation district right here in River City. And what do you think of a GW-based district right here on Pennsylvania Avenue? How does that feel to you?
So I, of course, haven't done a deep assessment yet of the area to really determine its overall feasibility. But clearly, the location, one here in Washington, let alone this dense location within the district, the strengths of GW, the availability of some developable land, and then this strong place management organization that is the Golden Triangle BID. All these things together really create this kind of critical mass of assets that certainly could provide that base on which a district could potentially be developed. But I will say that those assets alone, coming back to this issue of intentionality, probably won't be enough to drive development of a successful innovation district. And to really be successful, I think stakeholders are going to need to focus on a couple of things. First and foremost, it's really a matter of identifying and leveraging the unique competitive advantages of this area. So, what are the strengths of GW? What are the particular strengths vis-a-vis innovation and entrepreneurship, for example? How would that serve as a platform for future growth? What's the value proposition for firms to want to start or grow their business in this area or in this orbit of GW and firms that are already here, for example. So in short, I think it's about like what is the innovation in the innovation district, and that's really, really important to determine. In addition, stakeholders really need to focus on simply, developing a great place. A place where people want to live and work and recreate, but that also helps spur that idea exchange and that entrepreneurship. Innovation districts simply need to be building the kind of physical spaces and the physical environment that allows that innovation ecosystem really to thrive. Third, I think the stakeholders over time are going to need to focus, right out of the gate on ensuring that this isn't just an area for elite workers, right, or highly educated workers, but really how is it, accessible, inclusive, and connected so that you're really driving diversity in this area and really ensuring that it yields widespread economic benefit. And then finally, as you've said in your work with Tracy Lowe and in your report on catalytic development that came out last spring, it's about focusing on the long game, right? These innovation districts aren't going to crop up overnight, but really are going to take long-term intentional investment. It's about setting a vision and setting goals and strategies against which that vision can really be realized.
So there's so much to unpack there. One thing that I really wanted to come back to was the concept of intentionality. I've done a lot of strategic planning for various places, whether they be downtowns or suburban town centers. And if you don't have that intentionality, don't waste your time. How does that manifest itself in a place like GW, Foggy Bottom, Golden Triangle Business Improvement District?
Sure. Well, as I said, I think in a lot of these areas, they've just been seeing a lot of market traction. It's been driven in part by some of the demographic trends that I referenced earlier, and certainly these trends in the innovation economy itself. And that's been generating some of this desire, demand for businesses and firms to be particularly, coming into and wanting to be near anchor institutions and collaborating with anchor institutions. But overlaid on top of that, it comes down to stakeholders really having to work together and really organize themselves for success to establish what is the competitive advantage here that we're trying to really drive. What are then our unique strengths, but also the weaknesses that could really hold us back from realizing that vision over time? And how does that inform everything from the kind of partnerships we want to be creating, collaborations among the university, for example, and businesses, creating those kind of spaces that allow, and the programming that allows that to happen. What does it mean for infrastructure investments? What's the city's role in all this, in the public sector, in terms of making those kind of investments, whether it's in parks or roads or other things that are needed for this area to become that kind of high quality place. And then when you think about, making it an inclusive and accessible place, what does it mean for everything from public transportation and how people can access the area? What does it mean for workforce development? And making sure that people have the education, the skills that they need to not just work here, but actually be contributors to the innovation economy as it grows. But all this is not accidental. It really takes that kind of long-term thinking and intentional planning and action.
Well, as you know, we have our first task force of the GW Golden Triangle Innovation District tomorrow, so we'll see just how intentional we are.
Sure.
I'd like to shift back to Brookings, and now that you're leading the Bass Center on transformative placemaking, can you define what transformative and what placemaking is?
Yep. So, as I've described in this era of major market and major demographic forces, we're seeing these new demands for place, and it's yielding, definitely yielding rewards for some people and for some communities. I think we see that certainly here in the Washington area of those places that have really seen that kind of revitalization and that redevelopment activity. But we're in an era that's really marked by stark inequalities, by income, by wealth, by race and ethnicity, by geography. And local and regional leaders from big cities to small towns are, I think, really hungry to leverage those demographic and market forces that are out there, but leverage them in ways that work for more people and more places. So this really provides an urgency and an opportunity to reimagine our approach to place and to help communities invest in what we and others are referring to as transformative placemaking. And this means at really a scale and an ambition to meet the needs of people and businesses, wherever they may live and work. So it means, really a few things, and this is really what drove us to launch the Bass Center. So, on one hand, transformative placemaking means investing in both the physical design and the programs that not only make nice places where people want to live and work and recreate, but also that empower broad and diverse networks of local entrepreneurs and community organizations, institutions, and workers to spur creativity, business development, and job growth. So again, these aren't just sort of attractive and nice places to be, but this is really about the economic proposition and the economic opportunity in these places. Second, transformative placemaking is really about scale. So it's not just investing in plazas or individual blocks or parks, but when we say transformative placemaking, we're really talking about these areas where there's a critical mass of assets, economic assets, physical assets, civic assets, and where they aggregate and connect. So whether those are in downtowns or innovation districts or arts and creative districts or even suburban business parks, this is really the scale that we're talking about, where we think these transformative outcomes can really occur. And then finally, it's about not just investing in those high amenity or areas that are already highly resourced. You see a lot of this revitalization happening in downtowns or along waterfronts, but it's really about investing in those places that have been long overlooked and underinvested, places that may have their own sets of assets, whether it's hospitals or community colleges or anchor businesses, and importantly, that have human capital assets, small businesses that are growing and developing workers, is recognizing the assets of those places and ensuring that the talents and the needs and the ideas of the stakeholders that are already in those places can really help drive new types of transformative investments in those areas. So, in short, it's really about remaking this relationship, this evolving relationship between place and the economy in ways that really promote both widespread and, importantly, locally led prosperity.
So we know that with metropolitan development trends, there are always unintended consequences, and you've been touching on those. Last week, there was a brand new report out ranking our metropolitan regions as far as the intensity of gentrification, and this is where DC is number one in the country. So we know that gentrification, affordable housing, displacement happens when these places are transformed. How would we address that?
Sure, and I think when we talk about gentrification, we have to sort of pull out what we mean, because I think that that how this emerges differs from place to place. On one hand, you have strong market cities like the district, where you're seeing a lot of this growth and activity. And there it's really focusing on, as I mentioned earlier from the beginning, of getting a handle on how this kind of development can benefit more people and particularly the people that are already there, and how, again, not only are they benefiting, but how they're an integral part of leading that development and have a really strong voice to make sure that people benefit from it and aren't simply just displaced by it. And that means certainly investing in affordable housing opportunities, and it certainly means ensuring that people, as I referenced earlier, can really connect to the growth as it's happening. So it really should make us think very deeply over the long haul about how are we, preparing our students for the workforce? How are we ensuring that people can connect to the jobs where they are? What are some of the place-based, ways when we think particularly about, the distances a lot of people are traveling for their jobs? How can we try to close that, what we call the spatial mismatch? One, through better physical access to jobs where they are and connecting them to people, but also through other types of access. How do people understand the jobs that are out there? How do they train for the jobs that may be, blocks from their house as opposed to, jobs that are far away? I think, though, on the flip side of the gentrification is really about this bigger issue around opportunity, because as much as in some areas there's fears around, the strong market displacing people and people, not being able to participate in that growth that's happening where they are. But we still have a lot of communities that are still being completely left behind, where there's still deep concentrated poverty, where we're seeing rising inequality, increased segregation in a lot of areas. And as I referenced earlier, I think here we need to be really thinking deeply about what are the kind of transformative placemaking activities that will be at the scale and that will be focusing on economic development and really building on the assets in those places, so that the people and the workers in them can really participate in and help drive that growth.
So that's focusing on where we're building opportunities in these walkable urban places,
Yep.
whether they be districts such as the innovation districts that we just talked about, or other kinds of walkable urban places. My research through Brookings, through here, has shown that we're only going to be using 2 to 5% of our metropolitan land for these walkable urban places where the future economy is in fact being created. And as you know, I wrote this article for The Atlantic entitled "The Next Slum" about 12 years ago now, talking about what's going on in our fringe suburban locations where these new slums are in fact being generated. I know Brookings has done the leading research on the suburbanization of poverty. How can we address this?
Sure, and all these, again, there's all these disruptive forces that are causing these positive growth and development in some areas, leaving other areas behind. Those areas that have historically been left behind. But now, added on to that, as you're pointing out, we've got this issue in the suburbs, too, where on one hand, you're seeing the suburbanization of poverty, and then in the commercial and office sector, you're seeing other patterns, that are being driven by, again, changes in retail and commercial development and demands, as well as in the innovation, community, too, where a lot of these suburban research parks are now scratching their heads. And we're getting some of those calls of places saying, wow, this model worked for us for decades, of people driving up into a very suburban style campus, going to work each day. And now we're realizing that this isn't necessarily what our tenants, what our firms or their workers necessarily want. They want to be in places that are more accessible, that are more walkable, where you can get minimally get a cup of coffee, interact with other workers, whether in their own field or in others. And so I think we're going to be having to look at what does this kind of remake look like of a lot of these areas, because we've, as you well know, have spent an awfully long time building the suburbs, and now as we're seeing these changing dynamics, it means for a lot of places they're going to have to be saying, wow, how do we retrofit ourselves to create the kind of environments where businesses and workers want to be, and importantly can actually access the work where it is via transportation systems.
So we've done research both at Brookings and here at GW looking at the urbanization of the suburbs, which is really probably the major driving trend here, because we've obviously been watching our downtowns redevelop over the last 20 years. And so a lot of the focus has been on those downtowns and downtown adjacent places and urban commercial places as they've been thriving. But the urbanization of the suburbs is a possible way that we can help out avoid the next slums.
Yep.
One of the things that you had mentioned a couple times now is about not just making these great places, but also transporting people to these great places. So we have seen, obviously, here in Washington, the rail transit system just explode and grow, and then now bicycles and scooters and AV. We're hoping to see automatic or to see cars that will be self-driving. How does these new transportation technologies fit into this future metropolitan development trends?
Sure, and I think time will tell on some of this and what the time horizon is. Right. But we're obviously seeing a lot of rapid changes. The rise of ride sharing certainly being one of them, and that's enabled in part by having greater density and proximity. And I think that's partly why you're seeing the rise, coupled with just the technology that enables it to happen. But that's already having its own influence, on whether it's on transit, certainly on the use of automobiles and what that will do in terms of people's need for need for their own personal automobile, depending on where they live. And even things, we've been in some of this discussion here in DC of, what does it do to the physical landscape in terms of how do you create, safer access to things like ride sharing? So that's just one. Clearly, I think places all around the country are continuing to look at, how can they invest best in public transportation systems that actually work for people. And that means different things in different places, whether that's new light rail systems in some communities, bus rapid transit, or just simply more efficient bus systems and routes that work for people, in some of these communities that just haven't seen those kind of updates. And look, that's a real burden for people who don't have a car and who have to rely on the public transportation system. So I think, all these are all these transportation investments we need to be cognizant of, but our development patterns matter to making them work more efficiently. And I think when we think about how our economy is growing and developing, not just in cities, but also in the suburbs, it's a lot easier to think about how you build efficient transportation systems when you've got nodes of development as opposed to that very decentralized kind of sprawl where it's almost impossible to build efficient systems. So I think it's not just about the systems themselves, but it's about the land use systems and the patterns that can enable us to build systems that actually work for people.
Because we know, of course, that transportation drives development. It is the first mover. And so we now know that we need a portfolio of transportation options, not just one size fits all, meaning that if you want to participate in society, you must drive a car, period, in the paragraph. Now we need multiple ways of getting around: rail transit, cars, bus, scooter, walking. But once you're there at these transformative places, everything is within walking distance.
Yep.
I'd like to end by focusing on how to do this. And we've always heard the phrase public-private partnerships. I've always been partial to flipping that and referring to private-public partnerships. Most of the best cases we've seen throughout the country are led by the private sector. Talk about the implementation.
Sure. Well, when we talk about transformative placemaking, at this, in terms of the scope that we want to see, more inclusive economic development that's really locally led, and at this scale that we're talking about, it's really going to demand, that a range of actors are involved, and that includes the private sector, the public sector, and certainly the nonprofit and civic sectors as well. Ideally, local stakeholders, whether that's residents and workers and local businesses, place management organizations, nonprofit organizations, all those who are actually on the ground in these places. I think ideally we can create the kind of systems where they can be setting a lot of their own vision for their communities and the strategies that they want to see in those communities, and the specific placemaking activities that they want to see take place. But certainly it's the private sector, actors that can really need and are needed to bring that kind of capital and investment in to ensure that a lot of these activities can actually happen, whether that's on the real estate side, the development community that's making those kind of investments, ideally in it, as we said before, for the long haul, so that they're really creating great places in the process, and also bringing capital in, by investing in businesses, and hopefully all in ways that align with the vision of a lot of the local stakeholders that are already there. But then here the private and the public comes in, that the public sector obviously plays a really critical role, and they need to play that co-investor role, right?
Exactly.
In the infrastructure investments, in economic development investments, in things like parks and other amenities, things that the public sector is uniquely positioned to do. At the same time, they need to create the regulatory environment, things like zoning, the brass tacks kind of stuff that can actually enable this kind of development happening, and that really facilitates growth over the long haul. So it's really an all hands on deck, kind of situation to really make these places flourish and thrive.
Well, as you know, since we have our first task force meeting tomorrow, that it will be the major property owners, some of the largest in the country. It'll be the nonprofit place manager, Golden Triangle. It will be GW, a nonprofit private institution, but not the city. we feel that we have to get our act together before we approach the mayor about how this could evolve.
Sure, and what we've seen is certainly in a lot of these areas, it really is locally led,
Yes.
and you want to get that support of the public sector, but they're not necessarily the ones always driving it, nor probably should they be.
Right. So Jennifer, thank you so very much for not just being here at GW, but for the last 20 years of working together. And I'd also like to thank the audience, all of you who have joined in person and online, and invite you to the next session of George Talks Business. George Talks will continue on April 1st. Our next guest is Tony Sadana, who's president of Transformative. He's a former VP of Procter & Gamble's Global Business Services and IT. He will be discussing digital transformations, the why and the how. We look forward to seeing you then in person or online. Thank you very much.